After you've done all that you can, you just stand. It is indeed my honor to be here with you tonight to share with my friend, Pastor Amy. I want you to know, Pastor Amy, you would hear the same thing at my church. That's just how that goes. So delighted to be here with those who are on the pulpit tonight. One of the reasons that I'm really in awe of this moment is because I realize the significance of standing in this place on this day. I'm here to share with you in worship and to join in reflection on one of the greatest movement leaders of our time, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I've come today to challenge us to not only celebrate Dr. King and his contributions to the struggle for human and civil rights, but to emulate his courage and conscience in the face of empire. April 4th of this year will mark 50 years since Dr. King, accompanied by Amherst College professor Henry Commager, Union Theological Seminary President John Bennett, and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, stood in this very church before a gathering of 3,000 people to deliver a prophetic word condemning the Vietnam War and yet reaching beyond Vietnam to address our country's love affair with white supremacy and capitalism. Over and above our moral mandate to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. This is not the first time Dr. King spoke out against the war, but in appearing that night at the invitation of a group who identified themselves as clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, Dr. King was driven by a clause he'd read in the executive summary of that organization. There comes a time when silence is betrayal. No longer could the hypocrisy of fighting forces abroad while ignoring the lethal consequences of poverty, racism, and increasing militarism within our own country be denied. No longer could Dr. King stand silently by and deny the connection between the violence plaguing the streets of inner city neighborhoods and the state-sanctioned violence perpetrated by our nation. No longer could our country be allowed to sacrifice on the altar of supremacy and capitalism the lives of poor black and brown men who were frontline warriors abroad and second-class citizens at home. 50 years ago this year, Dr. King stood here at Riverside to deliver a message few wanted to hear. This speech, delivered exactly 1 year before his assassination, was not particularly well received by friends or by foes. Many, both inside and outside of the movement, accused Dr. King of reaching too far. And yet, King stood resolutely in what he knew to be true, that the moment had come for people of faith to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high ground of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. And here we are again, 50 years later, gathering on the birthday of Dr. King to remember the truthfulness of his words then and the truthfulness of his words now. It is important to remember, my friends, because if we do not remember, we can easily be lulled into believing a carefully crafted narrative of King that presents to us a preacher and prophet who was beloved in the movement and who has become beloved as a monument. The revolutionary stance of King came at a cost that is often glossed over in our retelling of the tale. This is why I love the story of David and Goliath. This is why the story of David came to my mind as I pondered this moment. I am mindful of the words of Kairo Diallo, the mother of Amadou Diallo, who himself was a victim of the hyper-militarization of these very streets in 1999. In her book, My Heart Will Cross This Ocean, when she says the only thing worse than the taking of one's life is the taking of one's story. We romanticize the battle of David and Goliath much in the same way that we romanticize the work of King in the movement. The work is messy. It's messy. And we like the imagery of David as a little boy with 5 little smooth stones, not really knowing what he was going up against, and somehow miraculously he wins because God is fighting for him. And we like the imagery of a king who dreams, who always turns the other cheek. But we don't want to deal with the messiness of either time. You see, David was not a little boy who did not know what he was doing. Goliath was not a singular enemy. Goliath came out of the ranks of the Philistines. There were many, but they chose one to raise a voice of bullying to all. That'll get to you all one day. So all of our attention goes to Goliath without any attention to the ranks from which Goliath came. Because Goliath is the big one who dares to come down and taunt everybody. But Goliath is not alone. And David is young, and David isn't in the army, and David is one that is underestimated. But the story of David tells us that David had already killed a lion and a bear, and David was a skilled slinger. He had practiced his craft. He didn't just pick up some stones and throw them in a slingshot like our 3-year-olds. And by the time it was the moment of battle, when David bent down and loaded a stone in the sling, he had absolutely no doubt that he would win. What happened in that moment of chaos, was that courage began to rise. And when courage, coupled with faith, rises, then Kairos appears. Dr. King had no physical stones, but he too was prepared for his moment. Leadership is never an accident, and victory is rarely a fluke. Yes, we honor the king who had a dream, but in addition to that dream, Dr. King had the courage of his convictions, and in addition to courage, he had a plan. In his speech 50 years ago, Dr. King suggested a need for a radical revolution of values, emphasizing love and justice instead of economic nationalism. Not only did he call for a radical revolution of values, but Dr. King laid out for the hearers the moral consciousness within his own being that compelled him to do so. For Dr. King, this prophetic cry was not rooted in party preference or partisanship. As a matter of fact, the Vietnam War continued under leadership of both parties. No, Dr. King did not challenge the deleterious effects of the Vietnam War on the most marginalized of our society because it was politically expedient to do so, but rather Dr. King states he did so because his consciousness left him no choice. So I ask you tonight, my friends, what is it that moves your conscience? For it is a call to self-examination. I am particularly mindful of the convergence of this year's King celebration with the liturgical season of Epiphany, which literally means to bring to light manifestations of a God who is among us. And this year, we are called to bring these manifestations of light and truth to bear as we prepare for an inauguration and transfer of political power that marks what has arguably been one of the darkest and most chaotic and troubling political seasons of modern times. What shall be the response of our consciousness to speak unflinching truth to internal fears and hatred that threaten to undermine our society? How did we get here? And how are we going to get out? How did we become a nation driven by fear as opposed to one accompanied by faith? In moments of chaos, my friends, courage must rise. In moments of cruelty, compassion must respond. In moments of confusion, community must prevail. In times of great fear and trepidation, we must resist the urge of self-preservation and boldly declare justice can never be about just us. Dr. King reminded us 50 years ago that we do not have the luxury of fighting for the rights of the Negro and ignoring the rights of the Vietnamese. Neither do we have the luxury of fighting for just us. We cannot allow fear to drive us to abandon a solidified front that demands equity for all of God's creation. This is a moment when consciousness leaves us no choice. We've seen such moments many times in Hebrew scripture through stories like that of Moses and of Deborah and of Esther, stories where against incredible odds and often against great resistance, courage rose out of chaos to confront political systems of the times. And in every instance, a Kairos moment emerged. A Kairos moment, that opportune time or place to say and do the right thing. A Kairos moment, that moment when change is possible. We saw that moment with Moses when he stood at the Red Sea. We saw it with the Hebrew boys when they faced the fiery furnace. We saw it in David when he faced Goliath. We saw it in Esther when Mordecai reminded her that if they weren't free, she wouldn't be free either. And we saw it not just in scripture, but we saw it in Rosa when she refused to give up her seat. We saw it in Martin and John Lewis and Snick and Sister Antonia Ebo from St. Louis, Missouri when they marched across the Pettus Bridge. We saw it on the streets of Ferguson as young people led us in mass demonstrations, spreading and preparing for a revolution of values. We saw it in Jeremiah Wright when he refused to compromise the gospel to be politically correct. We saw it in President Barack Hussein Obama when he stayed the course in spite of those who wanted to get him off of track. And we saw it, my friends, in Officer Stephen McDonald, who died here just 5 days ago, an officer who was shot and paralyzed by a teen in 1986, but refused to let hate win. All of these people facing moments of chaos. And I hate to tell you, we're in a moment of chaos right now. That's what these walls are about. Walls are never a sign of strength and power. Walls are about fear. Walls are always about fear and not strength. And can I tell you a secret? It is impossible to build a wall to keep anybody out without locking yourself in. Walls are about fear. That's what registries are about. Registries are about fear and not faith. And the only way that we make a stand of courage in this moment is if you register one, you must register us all. That, my friends, is what deportation is about. We all came over here one way or another on a ship, and now we all in the same boat. So we better fight together. Because if we feed fear, we will always be consumed. This is chaos. But just as when chaos hovered over creation, God was present. Kairos is still near. We see the chaos all around us, but wherever there is chaos, I just believe that God is there waiting to move. So what will we do with this Kairos moment? Dr. King's consciousness, and I dare say the collective consciousness of a society founded upon moral principles of human equality and the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, even if we haven't gotten there yet, compel resistance to any form of government that acts contrary to the best interest of all of its citizens. In this moment, courage must arise. I spent the large part of the last 2 years preaching and speaking against what I believed to be the original sin of this nation, and that I believed to be racism. I believed that until I had the occasion to go to the Vatican. And at the Vatican, I had a conversation with Cardinal Turkson. Cardinal Turkson is the author of the encyclical on climate that Pope Francis released. It is rumored that he is possibly in line to be a pope. But in our conversation, I began to talk about this original sin, and Cardinal Turkson challenged me. He suggested that perhaps racism is not America's original sin. Perhaps America is no different than the rest of the world, and that indeed our original sin is much deeper than racism. Perhaps our original sin is the desire to be God. To create and to legislate authority from the image of a God who looks like us, who acts like us, who thinks like us, who loves what we love and who hates what we hate. And from this sin, from this root, all forms of oppression feed and all forms of oppression grow. And we must resist the fearful urge to save ourselves at the expense of somebody else. Our fight must be firmly rooted in justice and not simply tethered to a particular cause. We cannot afford to separate sexism from racism, from heterosexism, from xenophobia, from religious intolerance. We cannot afford to silo ourselves. The revolution needs us all. I know some of you don't like this. I'm in good company. Some didn't like King's speech either. Both the Washington Post and the New York Times criticized the speech, saying that King had diminished his usefulness to his cause. Yet here we are, 50 years later, still celebrating a man who dared to believe God more than he believed the Times. On that night 50 years ago, Dr. King said these words, "This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties that are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers." These are the words of the one that we come to celebrate tonight. This was his response to the chaos of his time. What shall be our response? What weapons shall we wield? If we fight with the weapons of those that we are standing with when they don't fit us, we, like David, will be encumbered and have to lose them. If we try the strategies of those that we stand against, we will be ill-equipped for the journey. Our weapons must be the weapons that suit our cause. Our weapons, like King's, must be to fight hatred with love, to fight pessimism with hope, to fight fear with courage, to fight rhetoric with conviction. If, my friends, we commit to work together and to fight with that which we know is right, no matter how chaotic this moment may seem, Kairos is near. And we will have our opportune time for justice to prevail. Thank you.